Hey, welcome back to our study this week. This is part 2. We're looking at Titus 1, 5 through 6, talking about how Paul set Titus in Crete to put things in order that was not done yet. And so that's what we're talking about. And so let's begin with Paul. Now, during Paul's journeys to different parts of the world, he preached and planted churches. Eventually, he sailed to the island of Crete. The phrase, "I left you," in our verse, implies that Titus was with Paul when he went to Crete. This was Paul's modus operandi, right? This is how he worked. He didn't do it alone. He was not a lone wolf out there all on his own. Even in prison, he had people that would come to him, minister to his needs. That's how the church has worked from the beginning. Jesus didn't call the apostle, he called 12 apostles, right? Jesus didn't send his disciples out all on their own, but he paired them up and sent them out 2 by 2. The work of the church is not a solo activity. It's done in a community, together. For whatever reason, Paul did not stay until the work of establishing the churches in Crete was done, but he left Titus to complete the work. Paul had confidence enough in Titus to leave him, which says volumes about Titus. Yet he needed this letter of command and encouragement to finish the job. Sometimes we need that as Christians. We say, yeah, I can do this, but then you meet the challenges and the criticism and the attacks. Our zeal is kind of stifled and we need help. This is why Paul, writing to encourage Titus, is so important. Notice too that Paul left Titus. This was deliberate and strategic. It wasn't by accident. Paul started the work by preaching of the gospel. And now Titus was there to complete the task of establishing the churches on the island. Gospel ministry is not something in which we fly by the seat of our pants. It should be deliberate, reasoned, biblically justified. We work not just for today or tomorrow, but 5 years, 10 years, 100 years down the road. We're trying to lay the foundations that are based on Scripture. And these foundations then should stand the test of time. They shouldn't go away just as soon as we're gone. They should continue on forever. This is exactly what Paul instructs Titus to do, to set things in order. He is to take those infants in the faith and instruct them in order, and then place them in order within the church. Yes, there is order within the church. There's a proper way to act. There are specific roles that people are to fulfill. There are qualifications that must be met. There's a standard of doctrine that must be adhered to. There's a way Christians are to act and treat one another. As Paul told the Corinthians, all things should be done decently and in order. It's 1 Corinthians 14:40. So Paul's letters are full of this type of order of doctrine and order of practice. We'll see this as we progress through the book. Now, the next thing he says is that he needs to appoint elders in every town. And that's the first point, right? He wants to make sure that Titus is doing the work that he was left there to do, and that is to appoint elders. Though Crete is less than around 50 by 270 miles, that's how big the island is, at that time it still had over 100 cities, so there's quite a few people on the island. Now, can we assume that every city had Christians? Probably not. But those that had a Christian presence, Titus needed to appoint elders for those churches. Every local church within the cities was to have elders installed to lead, to instruct, and protect the Christians. These men were chosen from among those that lived in that city and were given the office of an elder. It's safe to say that Titus did not just randomly choose someone. He had the list of qualifications from Paul, which we'll look at later. The people of the city had to have known the men and would vouch for them. The job that Titus was given would be hard and time-consuming, but needed to be done if the churches were going to survive and thrive on the island. Now that leaves us with the last phrase that Paul says in verse 5, "As I directed you." Before Paul left Crete, he gave Titus a to-do list, which could have been oral instructions, but now Titus has a written copy of the commands. This would show that Paul had his apostolic stamp upon Titus and Titus's work. This is important because in Titus 2:15, Paul tells Titus, "Let no one disregard you." Titus was on a mission from God, but by way of Paul. For someone to disregard Titus in his work in Crete would be equivalent to denying God. Titus would encounter those that would question his authority to do the work he was doing. He was directed to do the work by Paul. If he were to be a Christian in good standing, then he had no choice but to follow through on what his task was. Did Titus complete his mission? Well, from Scripture, we're not told. But we find in church history that elders from Crete attended important synod meetings, meetings of the clergy, from early church and on. So if it wasn't Titus, then someone set up elders in those churches. And so, we might be able to safely assume at least he started that work in Crete. Now, tradition tells us he went back to Crete and helped preach there. We also know that he left Crete, which he wasn't to leave Crete until he was done. And so we find later on when Paul's writing to Timothy, that he says that Titus had moved on to Dalmatia, which would then imply that he in fact did finish the work of setting up elders and then moved on from Crete. So that's our first study in this look at 1 Titus here, 5 through 6. Now tomorrow we'll look at verse 6. I'm going to start looking at some of the qualifications for an elder. There's a specific group, there's really two groups that Paul gives to Titus about how a man is to be qualified. And so we'll look at the first group, and then next week we'll look at the second group. So come back next time, we'll look at verse 6.